Welcome back into the Pick and Roll NBA podcast with Jet and Sap, presented by Full Press Coverage. You can find this podcast and a bunch of other great podcasts on fullpresscoverage.com. You also find some articles there. You can find our podcast wherever podcasts are in fact found, or on our YouTube, youtube.com/Jet Stryer. That is my name. Sap, I know we often start with Lakers or Celtics talk. Today, we're going to start with the Lakers because they have the bigger news, which is Anthony Davis re-aggravating an injury, LeBron James not showing up. What is going on in Tinseltown, even though I hate that name for it? But what's going on in L.A.?
La La Land. How's that sound?
Let's just call it Los Angeles.
It's one of your favorite cities, though, right?
I do love it there, but not when it's related to the Lakers.
No, that's true. What about the Dodgers, the Rams, and the rest of the teams there?
Them I don't mind so much.
Okay, it's just the Lakers.
Yeah.
All right. Anthony Davis in the game last night against the Clippers ended up with back spasms. He went down after taking a three-pointer. Looked like he kind of hit his back on the table on the side, the scores table, or whatever the case may be. He started to grab at his leg, which, of course, he's had issues with the Achilles and the calf muscle there and kept him out over 2 months. Look, Anthony Davis is not a durable guy, has never been a durable guy. I think the Lakers did benefit last year with a 4-month break due to the pandemic, so that it got him rested up and ready for the stretch run, and he was fantastic in the bubble throughout the playoffs. LeBron benefited from that as well, being at the time 35 years old. This is back spasms, which I think could be somewhat related to the issue with the Achilles and the calf, because once you have something going on in one of your legs, oftentimes you overcompensate, so it may start to impact the other leg or somewhere else in the body, especially when we're talking about a 6'11" person. And look, the Lakers aren't going anywhere if Davis and LeBron James are both at 75%. I know you are more confident in them than I am, but we'll see what happens with Anthony Davis, how many games he misses. LeBron came back from his high ankle sprain, played a couple games, didn't look himself. He shut it down as well, and it just looks more and more likely that the Lakers are going to have to go through the play-in tournament as the number 7 seed, which means they could play the Golden State Warriors in a play-in game. Winner moves on, loser then would play the winner of the 9-10 matchup. I'm sure the league is looking at it and saying, Lakers Golden State play-in tournament game. Yeah, sign me up for that. And maybe the other one in the Western Conference would be Memphis with John Morant and maybe Zion Williamson with New Orleans. I mean, those would be 4 pretty high-profile teams in terms of star power, if that's the foursome that makes it into the play-in tournament. Does not look good right now in Los Angeles. It just doesn't. They need both of those guys close to 100%. The Western Conference is deep, talented. If they're at 85, 90%, I think they can make a real run at it. But if they're at 75% and coming in and out of games with injuries, it's going to be difficult.
Yeah, I've always thought that they've been playing this, extremely extra cautious with LeBron and more specifically with AD. So, I think any sort of injury that flares up or any sort of minor ache or pain that flares up with AD, they're going to just go above and beyond to protect him. I think that's sort of what happened the other night. And they, with an abundance of caution, pull them. Because like you said, if they're healthy in the playoffs, that I just don't believe they're going to lose in the Western Conference. And we talked about, LeBron trying to create sort of a narrative for the Lakers and for himself in this postseason. I still kind of think that's what's going on here. Listen, obviously, they didn't want to be in a situation where they have to be in a play-in spot. They'd rather be in, any of those other seeds. But that's the situation they sort of find themselves in right now, is they're in real danger of being in that play-in tournament. So maybe the extra rest backfired a little bit on the Lakers, but I can't see them dropping 2 straight with LeBron and Anthony Davis to be eliminated from the playoffs completely. So I still, until they are eliminated, I still believe that they're the favorites out West. And I still have a lot more confidence, I guess, than you that they're going to come out of the Western Conference. I just see a lot of really good regular season teams. And I don't see any teams that have proven it in the postseason. Even, talking about the Suns and how great their regular season's been, and they're playing well right now. and Chris Paul's getting some MVP consideration, which, that's fine. I don't think he has any legitimate case at the actual MVP award, as some people are making, but certainly he has a case to be on the top 5.
Mhm.
But even it's not like he's had a whole lot of postseason success in his career.
No.
So I don't see a team other than perhaps the Clippers, who last year were very unimpressive in the playoffs, that can really put a scare into the Lakers. The records look really good and they look scary out west, but I don't think it's as deep or as intimidating as people are really making it out to be. So I still have a lot of confidence in the Lakers, even though, that drives me crazy as a Celtics fan, and I don't want to believe they're going to be good. I just think that since the start of all this injury talk, and even though they've slipped in the standings significantly, I see LeBron and Anthony Davis at least healthy enough in the playoffs to the point where they're still, to me, the heavy favorites in the West, regardless of where they end up seated. So again, until they are eliminated, I'm betting on the Lakers.
You look at the Western Conference, and the 3 highest seeds are Utah, Phoenix, and Denver. I don't think anybody's frightened of those teams. They've all had great regular seasons. Nikola Jokic should win the MVP. Chris Paul in Phoenix is going to be a top 5 finisher for MVP. Utah's been really the best team in basketball record-wise, pretty much from start to finish. But I don't think anybody takes those 3 teams, I wouldn't say seriously, but as legitimate title contenders. I think if Denver, Utah, Phoenix ends up hoisting the Larry O'Brien trophy in July, we'd be somewhat surprised. The team that still scares me the most in the Western Conference, the Clippers, because Kawhi Leonard has done it. Rajon Rondo has done it. We know Paul George has struggled in the postseason. Heck, their coach coached the championship team in 2016, and Ty Lue. Yes, he had LeBron James and Kyrie Irving, but that team was down 3-1, came back and won games 5, 6, and 7 against Golden State to win the championship. So they're the team that frightens me the most. And I've always felt that if the Lakers could just avoid the Clippers for as long as possible, that would improve their chances. Now, if they're the 7 seed and have to go through the play-in tournament, I think they should be able to beat Golden State, which would sew up the number 7 seed for the Lakers. If they lost to Golden State, then they'd have to play the winner of, say, Memphis, San Antonio, or New Orleans, whichever 2 of those teams are the 9 and 10 seeds. They should be able to beat that team in a 1-game scenario. So if that was the case, they'd be the 8 seed, which means they would play either Utah or Phoenix in the first round. I'd still feel confident about that, but depending on the health of LeBron James and Anthony Davis. I think LeBron James by himself could win that first round against either Phoenix or Utah. I think he could win a second-round series against, say, Denver or Portland, whoever. I don't know if he could beat the Clippers by himself. I think he's going to need Anthony Davis at pretty much 90, 95% to pull that off. LeBron's track record is when the playoffs start, he's a different player, but he is 36 years old, and this high ankle sprain, I think, is real. I know that you and Skip Bayless thought that he milked this and he could have come back in a week or 2. I'm going to start calling you, Skip Stryer or Jet Bayless, because I think that's a compliment. He makes $8.5 million a year, right? So that's not bad. But no. I think the high ankle sprain was real. And again, as you get older, it's tougher to come back from that. I know he's Superman, but 2 out of the last 3 years, he's had injuries, and he still is a mortal. But again, I have confidence that he'll get himself healthy, ready to go. And who knows, maybe that play-in tournament might actually work better for the Lakers, because then they could avoid the Clippers, which still, to me, could be their kryptonite in the postseason for as long as possible.
Yeah, I think that the Anthony Davis injuries is more serious than the LeBron injury, more concerning. If I'm going to have a concern about LeBron right now, it's this statement that Frank Vogel made, and this is coming from Dave McMenamin of ESPN. LeBron's absences from the Nuggets and Clippers games were considered excused by the Lakers to allow James time to stay off the ankle. However, Frank Vogel said that LeBron's absence from the Lakers' last 2 games were not medically related. And when he was asked the reason James was not present, Vogel said, he's just not here. So some conflicting reports sort of coming out of LA. I guess the bigger concern for me than LeBron's injury, not injury, whatever you want to call it, is it seems like he's frustrated, not
Hmm.
necessarily checked out because I don't think he's ever fully checked out, but I don't know what the deal is now that his coach is saying it's not a medical thing and he just ghosted the team for the past 2 games. So I don't know what's going on with LeBron right now, where his headspace is at.
I think he's very frustrated, Jed. Again, he probably sees the finish line approaching. He's 36 years old. I've felt that he could play till he's 40 at a very high level. Maybe that's not the case. This isn't Tom Brady playing football. This is LeBron James playing basketball. There's more that gets taxed on your body playing basketball than football. The way the quarterbacks are protected in the NFL, Tom Brady throughout the postseason was barely touched. He plays with his mind, as does LeBron James. But there are times where LeBron has to exert his physical dominance, and maybe it's just not there. So he could be frustrated that he sees the finish line approaching. I think there's a few other things. The offseason was so short. It was only 71 days. Normally, it's double that after you win a championship. You get 4 months between the end of one season and the start of the other. So that's got to be taxing on a guy who turned 36 in December. I also think that, like Michael Jordan, so much has been placed on these two players' shoulders, right? I mean, they're the face of the league. They're the person that carries the league. The pressure for them to perform on a nightly basis is so great. It's even more heightened with LeBron James because now you have nonstop sports talk radio in all the major markets, oftentimes with 2 sports stations. You've got ESPN, Fox Sports 1 with around the clock talking heads. So there's a lot of pressure every time. If LeBron has an off game, is he still the best player in basketball? If he misses games, is he immortal now? So there's so much pressure that's on him. I think also he weighs into a lot of the social issues, which Michael Jordan never did. And I think that LeBron does. And at times it takes something out of him. The whole China issue a year ago, I think, kind of bothered him. He was able to plow through that and win a championship. But we remember about 3 weeks ago when he put that tweet out that, you're next to the police officer that shot the young black woman. He got a lot of pushback from that. I don't think LeBron handles being the villain well. And he is a polarizing figure. Half the country loves him, half the country hates him. And I think that probably wears on him as well. So I think mentally, physically, the guy is probably drained at this point. He's been in the spotlight approaching 20 years. Those are broad shoulders that he has, but sometimes the weight is too much.
I do think he has a little bit of front runner tendencies in him as well. When
Mm-hmm.
things are going well, he's front and center and wants all the credit for it and should fairly get all the credit for it too. But when things aren't going well, he doesn't. We saw this 2 years ago with the Lakers. He wasn't around. He was unhappy and sort of checks out a little bit. And things obviously for the past month and a half have not been going well with the Lakers.
Right.
He hasn't been playing. AD hasn't been playing, but this is a weird sap just because it could have easily Frank Vogel could have easily just said, "Oh yeah, it's about staying off the ankle. It's a medical thing." But instead, he said he's just not here, and
Right.
actually went out of his way to say it's not medically related, and so I'm not sure where LeBron is. Obviously, you'd like even if you're hurt to be the player to be there.
And
On
he's
the
been there
bench.
for every game but the last 2, including road trips. So
Right. So
he's fulfilled that.
I don't know what's going on right now with him. And I know he
Yeah.
had that quote the other week about being frustrated with the play in and saying that whoever came up with it should be fired, even though actually last season he advocated for the play in tournament. So I do think if there is a concern, it's less about the injuries to LeBron and Anthony Davis and more about is LeBron so frustrated to the point where it could affect his play, or maybe is it affecting chemistry with the Lakers? If he's not around right now, are some players, especially guys who are new on the Lakers this season, are they maybe unhappy with what LeBron is doing? That to me is a bigger concern than the actual injury.
Well, if we go back to 2008 when Tom Brady got hurt the first game of the season against the Kansas City Chiefs, as soon as he needed to go under the knife and rehab, he was away from the team. Some people had a problem with that. To me, it's whatever makes the superstar happy in terms of rehabbing and getting healthy. So if that's the case with LeBron, that he feels that he needs to be away from the arena to get rehab, I'm sure he's got all the facilities at his mansion in Southern California to deal with that. Again, you would like to see the Lakers, who I don't think are a really good organization. They've kind of stumbled upon some great players. Magic Johnson in the draft, and Jerry West made a great move to get Kobe Bryant. But
right, even
I'm
Jeannie
not
Buss put her foot in her mouth recently, talking about like the
right.
greatest Lakers of all. No, they're not.
They're not a well-run organization. And by the way, apparently, I don't think the Celtics are as greatly run as everybody thinks, because they can't seem to make the bold moves that you need to do to make things over. But they tend to keep they do tend to look. I think the best run organizations in basketball are probably the Spurs and the Heat. You kind of get that feeling, because you got Popovich and Pat Riley are kind of authoritarian figures. It's like everything goes through them.
Yeah.
But I think what happens with the Lakers, when Jerry West was there, it was a well-run organization because they made all the right moves, they drafted well, et cetera. But they got Kobe Bryant, they got Shaq to go out there, and Kobe was the 13th pick in the first round by Charlotte, and then they traded Vlade Divac for him. So how's that for a move? But of late they kind of were able to get LeBron and get AD away from New Orleans. It's not like they had this master plan. They're not the Spurs of Tim Duncan and Greg Popovich. So you would think that they could at least get their stories straight, even if it means lying. Don't make LeBron look bad, and don't let the head coach look bad, because you want to at least say, well, we just think LeBron needs to be away. Mentally, you don't even have to go there. Just say he's away right now with other commitments. Could be a family thing. Again, he's got 3 kids and multiple businesses. He's been to every game up until the last 2. But again, this is the most polarizing figure in American sports. One of the most polarizing people in America, forget just sports. So if he misses 2 games, it becomes national news. I mean, if Jimmy Butler misses 2 games due to injury and isn't on the sideline in Miami, no one really cares. And Jimmy Butler's an outstanding player and leader. LeBron does it, it becomes national talk show, topics.
Yeah, so I just look at it as, because I've never thought the injury was so severe to the point where it would affect him in the playoffs. And I still don't believe that. But I think if he's frustrated, and that frustration also alienates some teammates, that could have more of an effect in the playoffs to me than if he's actually hobbled or not. And I don't think that he showed frustration until the past 2 weeks, where they're now suddenly in danger of being in this play-in tournament. I know right now they're at the 6th spot, and they have a big game coming up against Portland. I think, is it tonight, Sap, or is it
Tonight,
tomorrow?
yeah. It's a big game because they're 1-1 in the season series with Portland. So the winner of tonight's game will win the head-to-head for the regular season and maybe put themselves in a good position to be the 6th seed rather than the 7th seed. This frustration also, Jet, may have occurred since he got hurt, missed 6 weeks, worked his ass off to rehab, came back, played 2 games, and then aggravated that injury and didn't look himself. So I think that's where the frustration comes. And it's almost like, man, I used to recover quicker from these injuries than I just did now. And I don't have the same burst or the same hops that I normally have. And this is a player that can still play at an extremely high level with his mind. I mean, he doesn't have to be the explosive player of 7-8 years ago. He can do it in multiple ways. But I think there's some frustration setting in. And I'm just waiting for Kyle Kuzma, who seems to be the unofficial or official team spokesperson, who, was politicking for more minutes for Marc Gasol over Andre Drummond. I'm sure that Kyle Kuzma, with his blonde-dyed hair, will have something to say on this at some point. He doesn't, is not afraid of microphones himself for a guy who's basically a 7th or 8th guy on a team.
Yeah, he likes talking. He likes the media attention. So yeah, things aren't great right now in LA. But again, I think if they win tonight against Portland, that basically gives them the tiebreaker in a game. So it basically gives them a 2-game leg up on not being in the play-in tournament. So all this talk about the play-in tournament could actually just go away, because if the Lakers win tonight, then I think they're in pretty good position to avoid it. If they lose tonight, then the opposite is true. So really a massive game.
I think they're going to have to go through the play-in. I really do, because the rest of their schedule is pretty difficult as well, with teams that are still jockeying for playoff position. And it may not be a bad thing, because if they win that, it's almost like they exhale and say, Okay, we got that out of the way, and now we're playing either Utah or Phoenix in the first round. Anything to avoid the LA Clippers. I think the Lakers even feel that way. The Clippers match up really well against them, and ever since the Clippers added Rajon Rondo at the trade deadline, that's the team I've been most frightened of. I have the utmost respect for Rondo. We saw what he did last year in the bubble with the Lakers, and I think he knows how to maybe get under the skin of LeBron and Anthony Davis, or at least understands their mentality and can use it against them in a potential 7-game series. So the play-in may not be the worst thing for the Lakers, other than you have to play another game when you could be resting to get ready for best of 7. That's the only big negative of that play-in tournament, especially if you lose the first one, because now you got to play again, and now you're playing 2 games to win 1 to get to the 8th seed. So, a lot's going to shake out the next week.
I mean, I only look at it, Sap, as there's 5 legitimate championship contenders to me in the NBA. The 3 teams in the East that we've talked about all year long for the most part: Brooklyn, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, and then the 2 LA teams in the West. Because it's very rare for a championship team to not have a top 5 player on it.
Right.
Pretty much. And Utah doesn't, and Phoenix doesn't.
No, as great as Chris Paul is, he's not a top 5 player anymore. He's not. He's going to be in Denver.
Sorry,
Jokic is going to win the MVP, but I don't think anybody thinks he's a top 5 player, other than maybe Kendrick Perkins, or some of the old big guys that love Jokic, and we both love Jokic.
Yeah, and they're missing their second best player.
Right. So I mean, I think you're right. I think if we were betting folks, we would say that one of those 5 teams that you mentioned will win the championship. Anything else would be a surprise, even though Utah and Phoenix have had phenomenal regular seasons, as Denver. Portland's a quality team that's playing well. But, I mean, in the end, it should be one of those 5 teams, because you're going to have to win 4 best of 7 series, and you do need the super duper stars to do that. And it appears that, probably 8 of the top 10 players in the league play on those 5 teams.
Right, yeah. Seeing Phoenix or Utah win, as you mentioned, them hoisting the Larry O'Brien Trophy at the end of the season, would surprise me more than when the Raptors won, honestly.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Because they don't have a player at the caliber of Kawhi Leonard.
Right. No, they don't. And also, let's not forget the year Toronto won, LeBron was in the Western Conference. He'd been dominating the Eastern Conference for a decade and a half.
Dominating
that was
Toronto
his first year in the West. Exactly. Toronto had trouble taking a game off of LeBron in any playoff series, let alone a series. So once he was out of the Eastern Conference, I think people in the Eastern Conference said, hey, we've got a chance here. And we all thought it was going to be Milwaukee till they fell apart against Toronto. Yeah, and Toronto, let's give them all the credit in the world for winning that championship. If Durant and or Klay Thompson don't get hurt in that finals, Golden State three-peats. I think we can all agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I can't know that for certain, but I do feel pretty sure that that's the case. So yeah, I would be shocked if, and I know a lot of people saying, oh, Utah and Phoenix, they're legit contenders. You need to be paying attention. I just don't see it. I think they're great regular season teams. And I think that the Lakers or the Clippers would take care of them. I just don't see them posing a threat. Even when the Rockets were really good, they at least, they had James Harden was at the top of his game and an MVP in the league. He was, so you could say, okay, I don't see them necessarily being the Warriors, but they could win a championship in a normal year when there's not an incredibly stacked team like Golden State in it. But these other teams, it's the 2 LA teams in the West, and it's the big 3 teams in the East that have a legitimate chance at it. So the Lakers obviously have some fixing to do right now, but again, I'm not that concerned about them, Sap. I haven't been, and I remain not that concerned about them, because I think once the playoffs starts, they're going to be a completely different team, and that team is the favorite in the West to me.
All right, let's hope you're right.
Well, I hope I'm wrong, but I do think I'm right, but I hope I'm wrong.
I'm cheering you on, Jet, for your take.
Sap, there's some coaches that seem to be in the hot seat that is basically dependent on their playoff lives. One of them actually is one of the coaches of a team we just talked about, and I think that might be the most interesting name. So we'll start with him. Reports are coming out of Milwaukee that Mike Budenholzer is actually on the hot seat, and if the Bucks fail to make it to at least the conference finals, that Milwaukee may look to make a move and getting rid of their current head coach and bringing in somebody new. I don't know how you could do a much better job than what Mike Budenholzer's done in Milwaukee, considering that he basically has had one superstar and then a bunch of kind of like, okay, pretty good players. Maybe you'd say they should have gotten to the finals one year, but he's won the whatever the NBA equivalent is to the President's Cup the past 2 years, having the best record in the league, and this year they're right in line with being one of the best teams in the NBA. Should the Bucks look to make a move if they don't get to the conference finals here, Seb?
Yeah, and I'm all about stability within an organization, but Budenholzer also had this issue in Atlanta. Now, in Atlanta,
That's
he
true.
never had a player quite like Giannis. I mean, he had 4 All-Stars one year, but none of them were as good as Giannis. They went out, made a really good move in the offseason to get Drew Holiday. They signed him to this huge contract, so they've got a lot of money committed to Giannis, Drew Holiday, Chris Middleton, and they've underachieved in the postseason the last 2 years. Remember, they had a 2-0 lead over Toronto in the Eastern Conference Finals 2 years ago. Last year, they never seemed to get together in the bubble. They ended up losing to Miami in 5 games in the second round. And Giannis was banged up at that point. Look, Giannis is playing better than ever. Holiday's playing at an all-star level. Middleton's doing what he does. They're playing excellent basketball. The narrative would be, look, you had the best record 2 years in a row and you couldn't get it done in the postseason. And then you were considered kind of an outsider looking in with not much pressure on you, and you couldn't get it done. I have him as the coach with the most pressure on him right now, because if it doesn't work, Giannis is going nowhere. Chris Middleton's going nowhere. Neither is Drew Holiday. They're going to have to make a change at coach. And, do they bring in a former player and try to fix it that way? There's pressure on Milwaukee. It seems like everyone's saying there's no pressure on them. But when you have a guy who won back-to-back MVPs and who's playing at the same level this year, and you've shown that you can beat Brooklyn and you can beat Philadelphia, it's set up for them to get to the NBA Finals. If they don't do that, I think Mike Budenholzer may be out of a job. He'll be unemployed for about 35 seconds because he's a fantastic coach, but it may be time for him to move on. I think he's the coach with the most pressure heading down the stretch.
So is your threshold a little bit higher, Sep? Do you think they need to make the finals as opposed to the conference finals for him to keep his job?
Yes. Yeah, they've already been there.
Even with Brooklyn being what they are with that sort of stacked team, you still think the expectation needs to be for Budenholzer to get this team to the finals this year?
Yeah, because, 1% owner Aaron Rodgers may weigh in on this. He wants out of Green Bay. He may want Mike Budenholzer out as the head coach of the Milwaukee Bucks. Maybe Brian Gutekunst, who's the general manager of the Packers, goes over and works for the Milwaukee Bucks at some point. Maybe that's Aaron Rodgers' grand scheme of things. But no, I think that's a real possibility, because we don't know what the relationship is with Giannis and Budenholzer. We don't hear anything bad about it. But if Giannis loses in the conference finals, or say the semifinals of the Eastern Conference, and goes to ownership and says, I think we need an upgraded coach, what do you think ownership's going to do?
Yeah, I just don't know who an upgrade necessarily would be.
It doesn't have to be an upgrade. Sometimes just someone different would work. And maybe Brad Stevens is that guy. Brad Stevens is out as Celtics coach, and the Bucks have all good things to say about Brad Stevens, and maybe a change of scenery for him would be better. Who knows how the NBA works?
Yeah, you're not wrong.
They do have a tendency of playing musical coaches in the NBA. It's not something we haven't seen before.
Yeah, I mean, I would trade Brad Stevens for Budenholzer if I was the Celtics management, but they may not feel that way. I remember before Budenholzer was the coach there, it was Jason Kidd, and that didn't work particularly well. Granted, it's not like he has a sterling reputation as a head coach, even when he was with the Nets beforehand. So I don't know. I like Budenholzer a lot as a coach. I don't know that they would be upgrading if they got rid of him. I agree. I think there is pressure on them, but I think Brooklyn being what they are, Sap, I think it's a tough ask to say you have to make the finals. Conference finals, I think, is reasonable. Finals against a team that's really stacked like that, I don't know. I think it's the same sort of threshold. Was it fair? It would have been fair to say D'Antoni has to lose his job if he doesn't get past the Warriors. I don't know. I don't think that was necessarily fair in Houston. And I know that's not why it ended, but I look at Brooklyn as like, man, it's like to me, it seems like it's the Brooklyn Invitational East. That's how good I think their roster is compared to everybody else's. So you're asking for a coach to have to pull off an upset in order to keep his job, and that seems like a high threshold to me.
Provided Brooklyn's healthy as well. And we'll see with James Harden. He should be back for the postseason, dealing with a hamstring. Do you know that Kyrie and Durant, in games they've played together without James Harden, are 7-9? They're below 500 as a duo.
That's
So
interesting.
as great as they are, they're not winning without James Harden. Like, we all agree Kevin Durant's the best player on Brooklyn, but I
Yeah,
think James Harden has evolved as the most valuable player on Brooklyn because he's really a true facilitator. Kyrie and Durant aren't facilitators. I think that Durant runs that offense to perfection and sets up Durant and Kyrie to take care of their business. So without him, they're 7-9 together. That's not very good. And we've seen they lost back-to-back games against Milwaukee earlier in the week, really entertaining games. But Milwaukee, which normally has struggled down the stretch of these games because Giannis has to try to face the wall and he's not very good at the free throw line. Well, down the stretch, Milwaukee was the better team. I have some other coaches that I think are in trouble as well. I have Budenholzer as number one, I think, because
right.
there's so much pressure on him because, he's had the two-time defending MVP and a guy who, again, if you look at Giannis's numbers this year, he's every bit as good as he was in those 2 years. It's
Sure.
just that
Yeah.
the narrative is going to change. You're going to maybe be surprised at this. I think Steve Nash's job could be in jeopardy if Brooklyn loses in the second round. At that point, I could just see Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant, going to
Blaming it
ownership
on
and
the
saying,
coach. Yeah.
blaming it on the coach. You know that's the scenario. I also think Frank Vogel could be gone, even though they won the championship last year. LeBron oftentimes picks and chooses his own coaches. I could see that potentially happening. Now, he tried to have a power play in Miami. When he got there, he was constantly telling Pat Riley, you got to come to the sideline, that, Eric Spoelstra is not good enough. And Riley pushed back and said, no, he's the coach. And they did win 2 championships. So those two guys, because the expectations are so high with Brooklyn and the Lakers, even though with these injuries both teams have faced, that, if those teams get knocked out in the second round, you could see Steve Nash gone, although he's making, I believe, $7 million a year, 5-year deal. But NBA teams have no problem with getting rid of coaches after 1 year on a big contract. And Frank Vogel could also be in jeopardy.
I think Vogel will keep his job because usually that buys you some time. Though the wrinkle is obviously that LeBron has basically unlimited power in LA,
Right.
and if he wants him gone, he's gone. And we know Vogel wasn't even their first choice when they were hiring coach. Maybe LeBron likes Jason Kidd. I don't know. It doesn't really matter who the coach is of a LeBron James team, anyways. But other names. So those are interesting names, Sap, that haven't necessarily been rumored. A couple of ones that have been, Terry Stotts in Brooklyn. The same sort of thing applies to him as Mike Budenholzer, is that there seems to be a threshold for Brooklyn to have to reach for Terry Stotts to keep his job. Probably, I would guess, getting out of the first round is the bare minimum he would have to do to keep his job. I think he's a pretty good coach. I think similar to Brad Stevens, he's run into similar issues where he is really good at developing the team and has sort of run into a wall here, having postseason success. Brad Stevens had more, but Stotts, I know a lot of Portland fans are frustrated with some late game execution with him. And but the same thing I'm saying with Budenholzer is like, I don't know if you replace him based off the roster that Portland has, like how high can they really go? I mean, maybe they could have a season like Utah or Phoenix is having this year, but I still think the ceiling would ultimately be losing in the playoffs to a team like the Lakers or the Clippers.
Well, absolutely. I mean, oftentimes when coaches get fired, you're like, well, who is out there that can be any better? But that's the easiest thing to sell to season ticket holders. And let's not forget, next year, in theory, it's going to be 100% capacity. So you're going to have to sell tickets again, get sponsors involved. And the easiest thing to say to a season ticket holder or to a big sponsor is, well, it just didn't work last year. We moved on from Terry Stotts and we're bringing in this name coach. Again, I'll throw Brad Stevens out there if he's gone from the Celtics. So just pick any other retread or a former player, which I think can sell well to the fan base. Maybe Portland goes out and tries to bring back someone who played there, who's involved in coaching. I don't have a name off the top of my head, but you get my point. Yeah. So that's something that can happen. It's like that in just about any sport. See this in baseball. They fire the manager and bring in someone else. And like, what exactly is that going to do? Sometimes it does work. We see the difference between Alex Cora and anybody else that managed the team recently. So with the Boston Red Sox. So I think that Stotts could be in trouble. And again, a lot of this depends on Damian Lillard. If Damian Lillard likes the coach, they probably keep him. If he doesn't, he's probably gone. But they're in a position where 2 years ago they made it to the Western Conference Finals, got swept by Golden State. No shame in that. And they were in those games. Last year they lost to who? The Lakers in the first round. Did anybody expect Portland to beat the Lakers in the first round last year other than Charles Barkley, who keeps betting on Portland to win the Western Conference? Maybe he'll be right at some point before he
put
dies.
100,000 on them this year to win the championship.
He loves the Portland Trailblazers. And Charles likes to change his mind from time to time. So that's going to be interesting. I think Stevens could be in trouble here. You don't think he is because it seems like he's got this job for life with the Celtics. But look, if they're in the play-in tournament, let's say they're the 8th seed in the play-in tournament and lose to whoever the 7th seed is he gone?
I would think so, Sepp. I think they're going to lose in the first round. I think if they lose in the first round, he should be gone.
Well, not if they're the 7 or 8 seed and they're playing Brooklyn, Philly, or Milwaukee.
But the fact that they're in this position, I do think he should be gone. Sepp, they've made it 3 of the past 4 years, and they're presumably Tatum and Brown are better than they were 3 years ago.
I still think the roster is not as good as it was.
No, but I think it's the same thing in Portland, right? The roster is more suspect, and that's the bigger issue. But it is easier to change the coach, and I've seen it times with the Celtics. And I'm not going to go on this whole Celtics rant about Brad Stevens because they've done it a million times. But I think that they've tuned him out for the most part. And once that happens, it's over. You don't regain the locker room after losing it. That never happens.
No,
in any sport, once the locker room is gone, the locker room is gone. And I think that's what's happened with the Celtics. So I think he could certainly be in jeopardy. Only reason he wouldn't be is because I do think that there's like an incestuous relationship with Danny Ainge, ownership, and Brad Stevens. They all seem to love each other. But I do think he should be gone. And Terry Stotts, again, fair or not, I get why Portland may be looking to make a move. But obviously the bigger issue is they just, like you said, they've lost to 2 teams that have won the title. And their roster is just, it's fine. It's okay. Your best player is Damian Lillard, who, if there's a really good team around him, conceivably he could be the best player in a championship team. But this roster isn't nearly good enough for him to be the best player in a championship team. And I like some of the guys they have. It's just, it's not close to being good enough. The move they should have made, and I said this before, Sap, is they should have traded McCollum or whatever for Harden. And then have Harden and Lillard as your backcourt. Then you have a legitimate chance at winning a championship. All these teams, for some reason, decided to pass on James Harden, leaving the door wide open for Brooklyn to get him for basically nothing. And I think that they're kicking themselves. Denver is another team that I think if they had just added James Harden, they would be a legitimate championship contender this year. Instead, their ceiling's the second round. So I think a lot of teams made a mistake, and I'm not a huge James Harden fan stylistically, but I do know that he helps the teams that he's on, and he's when he's playing at an MVP level, he's one of the best players in the league. And adding him to a team with Jokic or adding him to a team with Damian Lillard makes that team a lot better than Jamal Murray or CJ McCollum. James Harden's just much better than those players.
Yeah, he absolutely is. And maybe when LeBron buys the Portland Trailblazers in 5 years, 6 years, then he can make the proper moves to add to Damian Lillard, who still, in theory, would still be playing in the NBA in his early 30s because Dame is in his late 20s. He's still got plenty of good basketball left. But how many times in the history of basketball has a 6'1" guard led a team to a championship? Isaiah Thomas, but he had a great supporting cast with him in Detroit for back-to-back titles. Steph Curry's 6'3", he's not 6'1". He did win the title as the lead dog once, but then he needed to bring in Kevin Durant to win 2 more titles. 2 other coaches that I think could really be in trouble, and I've said this almost every time we do a podcast yet, Stan Van Gundy in New Orleans. Now, they're playing better than they were, say, a few weeks ago. If they can sneak in as the 10 seed into that play-in tournament, maybe that saves his job, and management can say, well, we played better down the stretch than we did earlier, so maybe his message is selling. I just think he's a bad fit in New Orleans.
He's at the top of your hit list.
He's at the top of my hit list. His style doesn't necessarily work anymore. Now, Tom Thibodeau's style which again, these are gruff guys, right? Old school, in your face type of guys. But Thibodeau, I think, has a little more cachet than Stan Van Gundy because he was an assistant coach with the Celtics. I mean, that's going deep down to try to find the difference between two coaches, but that can't hurt him. I think Stan Van Gundy is coached throughout the league for many years and had issues with star players. I think that kind of lingers. Didn't he have issues with Dwight Howard in Orlando, although Howard generally had issues with everybody that coached or played with him.
Also, Sap, the Knicks had no expectations on them this season.
No.
And the Pelicans did have playoff expectations on them this season.
Yeah.
So that certainly is one thing. And another is, Thibodeau's job is also, he's coaching up for the most part, aside from Julius Randle and like Derrick Rose, Jags and bums and journeymen. And
RJ Barrett, I would not call a Jag.
Sorry. RJ Barrett's not either.
Right.
But in New Orleans, he's got a couple all-stars in Ingram and Zion, and Lonzo Ball is a very good player. Hartley likes. Steven Adams is a very good player. And so I think that the message is more, if it's a similar message from Van Gundy and Thibodeau, maybe it resonates more with guys who have been sort of around the block and around the league and are trying to, stick around and stuff versus the guys like Zion and Ingram and Ball who are like, we're really high lottery picks. We don't have to listen to this guy. What the hell is he yelling about? He's not even.
I think that's the other thing too, and that's probably part of it. I mean, like Terry Stotts played basketball, is 6'6", 6'7", athletic looking, trim. I think the players look at him and say, okay, I'm going to take this guy seriously. Brad Stevens, is a youthful looking guy who looks like he could probably get involved in a scrimmage. He would get destroyed by obviously NBA players, but he kind of looks the part. Stan Van Gundy is essentially my height and 30 pounds heavier. And seriously, he's got that cheesy mustache. He looks like John Holmes, the former porno star. It just doesn't fit right on the sideline. I mean, it wasn't really a coincidence that Pat Riley and Chuck Daly were all-time great coaches. Those guys were cool. They dressed nicely. Chuck Daly had the huge head of hair. He looked like a mob boss or a union boss, and Pat Riley looked like a mafia don. That works with players in the NBA. And then there's Stan Van Gundy, who looks like he can't buy a shirt off the rack. He has to go get a special size shirt to fit him. I don't think it works over there.
I could see him being in jeopardy, Sep. I mean, they certainly underperformed. They're a game and a half out of that play-in right now, and even if they get into the play-in, they should be firmly entrenched in the playoffs right now, not in jeopardy of not even making the play-in.
Yeah, I mean, they got a better roster than Portland, don't they? I mean, I know Dame Lillard's, if you looked at those two teams, Dame Lillard would be the best player, but not by a lot because New Orleans has Zion. But, Brandon Ingram's pretty damn good. Lonzo Ball.
I think they've got
a pretty good roster. Yeah, they should be 7-8 games above 500, rather than 6 games under 500. And I think it's going to fall on the coach. One more coach that I think could definitely be in trouble is Nate Bjorkgren from Indiana. I just like saying his name.
The most in trouble.
Yeah, because look, they fired Nate McMillan after last year. Nate McMillan now is doing phenomenal work in Atlanta, right? Like Nate McMillan's going to get Coach of the Year votes, even though he's only going to coach about half the season. That says a lot. And look, I've always been a Nate McMillan fan. As a player, you would have loved him if you even remember him playing. He was an in-your-face defender. He and Gary Payton may have been the best defensive backcourt I've ever seen. Those two guys together were just a lot of effort and intensity and really effective. And I think he's a very good coach. I'd love to see the Celtics go to Nate McMillan if they move on from Brad Stevens. But I think Atlanta's going to do the smart thing and re-up with Nate McMillan and make him their coach. He's done a phenomenal job.
When he took over, they were out of the playoffs. Now they are the 5 seed in the playoffs. It's a big difference.
They're winning like 75% of their games since he took over. So Indiana went off of that guy to go to Nate Bjorkgren, who sounds more like a Swedish tennis player. And also something happened earlier this week, right, where their assistant coach, Greg Foster, got suspended for screaming at one of his players, and the player told him to shut the bleep up, and the player got fined. And that's just not a good look. If you're the head coach, you can't have your assistant coach and a player bickering. The head coach has to take control of the situation, and he didn't.
Yeah, that certainly was an eye-opening issue. And then there's a lot of reports coming out about Nate Bjorkgren's time as an assistant coach in Toronto, and that all the players hated him there. and that he was like the press secretary for Nick Nurse there, and like none of the players could get to Nick Nurse because Bjorkgren would like block them and say, "Well, what do you want to talk to him about? I'll make an appointment for you," or something like that. So
See,
he was
chief
not
of staff.
yeah,
Yeah.
he was not liked, I don't think, in Toronto, and I think he's having the same sort of issues with players in Indiana. I questioned it when they fired Nate McMillan last year because, I mean, they were injured and they had a nice bubble with TJ Warren, but nobody thought
Yeah.
that their team was that good, and so they lost early in the playoffs to the Celtics. No, I don't think they weren't favored in that series. The Celtics were supposed to win, and they did. And then they fired Nate McMillan. He'd done a pretty good job for them, and then he, like you said, he just takes the assistant job with Atlanta, and half a season in, he gets the head coaching job, and he's done a phenomenal job. And meanwhile, Indiana's the 9th seed right now in the East, and just a half game up on Washington, who started the year like 2-16.
Right. Yeah. And I think
So
it's time to move on from Nate Bjorkgren. I just like
so I
saying
don't.
his name.
It's a tough job to coach Indiana because you're not getting free agents there.
No.
But they
they kind of wanted one. They wanted one. Gordon Hayward.
They did.
Danny Ainge didn't let it happen. So
no, he blocked it.
That falls more on management or whatever the case may be, which I still think that was a stupid move by Danny Ainge. Take Miles Turner and whatever other piece they want to send to you rather than a trade exception what are you going to do with it?
They've ended up with what will be about a half season of Evan Fournier, who in his half season has played about 40% of those games. So
right, you could have Miles Turner, who's leading the league in block shots. That would be a nice piece to have.
Yeah, whatever. I mean, we can't just dive into the Celtics, but yeah, there does seem like there's a lot of coaches who are potentially in serious trouble in terms of finding unemployment. Now, it's not always created equal. Like, I think Nate Bjorkgren would find it difficult to find a new head coaching job. He'd probably have to settle for an assistant job. Mike Budenholzer, as you said earlier, probably gets hired immediately by any of these vacancies. So, not every head coach firing is made the same. And the pressure is different. But it could be a really interesting offseason in terms of the coaching carousel, because you just named like 6, 7, 8 guys who could all be out of a job.
Yeah, and two of the most high profile positions in the NBA, Steve Nash in Brooklyn and Frank Vogel in LA, only because those organizations are win now. They're in the win now mentality. So if any of their star players go to management ownership and say, we need someone different manning the bench, then that's what ownership is going to do. You're not going to pay Kyrie Irving, James Harden, Kevin Durant, over $100 million combined and cheap out on a coach if those guys don't want to play for Steve Nash. Same thing in LA with Frank Vogel. But I think winning the championship last year gives Frank Vogel, a little breathing room. Although the Lakers, they won a championship with Paul Westhead in 1980. About 15 months later, he was fired and Pat Riley stepped in, and we know the rest is history. But it's always interesting, obviously more interesting, the player movement in the offseason, but we'll see some coaches move. Look, last year, Doc Rivers went from the Clippers to the 76ers. We all agreed at that point, great move. The 76ers upgraded from Brett Brown to Doc Rivers, and we see what has happened this year. Philadelphia is a real title contender.
Yeah, that made a world of difference. Is the new GM and the new coach in Philadelphia. It's something that I hope the Celtics take a look at. And so, yeah, it will certainly be interesting, and it's something that we'll keep a close eye on. And there could end up being a lot of teams with new coaching jobs. And frankly, Sap, if the Nets, Lakers, and Bucks all get rid of their coaches, which I guess is a possibility, those are 3 plum jobs for any coach to want.
Absolutely. Yeah, there will be people that want those jobs. They come with a lot of pressure, but you'd rather coach talent than try to coach up mediocrity. That's simple.
Yeah. All right. So that's going to do it for this edition of the Pick and Roll NBA podcast with Jet and Sap, presented as always by our friends at Full Press Coverage. Got some good coaching talk. Sometimes in the NBA, the coaches don't get the spotlight, Sap, because it's a player-centric league, but they usually get the blame. So make sure you find our podcast wherever podcasts are found. Just type in the Pick and Roll NBA podcast with Jet and Sap right into your phone. You can find us. Download us, subscribe, rate the show 5 stars, make a comment about how much you love the show. And you can find us on YouTube again on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/JetStryer for the visual presentation. We'll be back on tomorrow, which is Saturday, with a fresh new edition of the podcast, talking about our friend Kendrick Perkins. He's got a list of the most dangerous players in the NBA. We'll talk about that. We'll also talk about who Damian Lillard thinks is the best player in the league. Let you know our thoughts on that. Until then, see you, everybody.